So we are live in Remote Work Europe, and really interesting subject we've got coming up today. I hope that lots of people are going to join us and ask questions of our very special expert. I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. But if you're listening live, then do drop us a comment at some point and tell us where you're from, because today's subject is all about the different cultures, different ways that we connect and interact. So actually, without any further hesitation, I'm going to introduce Chenge. I really hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, that was perfect.
Just an example of one of the challenges of intercultural communication is coming across a name that's unfamiliar and really wanting to make an effort to get that right. Lots of people get mine wrong. So I'll let Chenge take it away from here and introduce herself and her work.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maya. And thank you for having me here. I'm also very excited because, this is really a topic that just really gets me going for so many reasons. So I'm always happy to share this with people. I actually have a presentation.
There we go.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. So today's topic will be cultural fluency, which I will get into a second. But before that, I wanted to just briefly introduce myself. So my name is Chenge. I've been an intercultural trainer for over 7 years now. I'm the founder of Cultural Origami. And I basically work with different teams and individuals, helping them to understand different perspectives and each other better. And I do this through all kinds of training programs and courses and workshops around culture and team dynamics. And so my name may sound a little strange because I'm Hungarian. And Hungarian is certainly a very unknown language to many. It's also quite a complicated one. But I've been actually living in Spain, Madrid, for almost 10 years now. So I certainly understand quite well cultural differences and how those can really influence us a lot in different ways. And so today I actually brought quite a few things to talk about. After this brief introduction, we will dive a little bit more into what culture is, why culture matters, why our differences matter, like why this topic is really important for us. And that part will be a little more theoretical. So after that, I also brought a few examples and just like some practice. So you can see how these things manifest in our work life and in our lives. And of course, I also brought some tips and hints to be able to navigate this topic a little better. And there will be some time at the end for questions. But also, I was telling Maya earlier, if there are any clarification questions on the way, we can just stop after each section and just see if there's anything that needs
amazing. Yeah, just drop your questions into the comment thread, everybody, and we'll circle back to them. I'll keep an eye on those. Hi to Louise. We've got Swedish living in Spain. That's an interesting intercultural dynamic.
Oh, for sure.
Fantastic. So over to you then, and why culture matters and our differences.
Thank you. So that will be our first thing. And I actually brought an image, and I would just ask you to tell me what you see on the image. And this is it. Just curious.
So this is the old rabbit and duck, and you can make it even change direction if you blink and stare at it enough.
Yep. You're advanced. You're advanced. I like that. Now you're first.
I don't know what it says about culture, though. I just think that's a visual thing.
Yeah. So basically, based on what you see when you look at the picture, you can either see a duck, which is like looking like this is the beak and this is the eye. So the duck is looking to the left. For those of you who don't see the duck. And the rabbit is looking to the opposite direction. So this is the mouth, this is the eye, these are the ears. So this is one of those images that, you can interpret it in two different ways. And neither of them is good or bad. It's just about the different perspectives. But I like to bring this image up because imagine a conversation between two people, one of them seeing the duck, the other one seeing the rabbit. But they don't realize that both are in the image. And so that conversation can get very frustrating very fast. And this is what can also happen when we face cultural differences, that if we don't realize that there are more perspectives to the same thing, and we need to learn to flex our mindset to understand those differences, that can cause us a lot of frustrations and misunderstandings. And so this is why I like to use this image, because I think it links in nicely to to our different
Fantastic.
perspectives.
The duck is winning the comments at the
Yeah,
moment,
is it?
but we know it's not competitive, so
No, and it really,
equally valid.
yeah, it really doesn't matter whether you see the duck or you see the rabbit, because both are there. So it's just really the perspective. But the good thing about this is that, and what I also like to say about cultural fluency, which I will get into a second, that once you have this skill of being able to see the different perspectives, you cannot really unsee it. So that's what happens with also this image. Like once you know that both are there, you are able to see them both. So that's why I like to point out that this is really a skill that is just valuable for life, really, and for so many situations. And with that, yes, let me get a little bit more into what exactly is cultural fluency, because that might not be a term that everybody's familiar with. So it's basically, I like to call it the superpower of understanding others and just connect with people from different backgrounds. So this is basically a skill that helps us expand our mindsets and see our own patterns differently, and through that also understand that there are different perspectives to most things. And I like to use the term cultural fluency. You might have heard cultural intelligence or cultural competence or cultural agility. Like there are a lot of terms for this. But I do like to use cultural fluency because for me, this is something similar to learning a language. You start with learning certain words and you learn the grammar, and then you just chain things together. And then some days you feel that you really get the hang of it and everything flows. And then other days it's just a complete disaster. And so it's the kind of skill that I think it's not really linear. It's really a journey. And it also depends, of course, your own individual situation, the changes, the environment. And so this is really just a muscle that we are growing and we need to practice so it gets better and that it serves us more to navigate our interactions. And yes, it takes time and patience and certainly a lot of willingness to develop self-awareness. But then, as I said, once you get the hang of it, it really helps you navigate so many different things in life. And with that, I also wanted to touch a little bit on what is not cultural fluency, because I also tend to get some questions. And yeah, I think that's important to mention these two. So certainly it's not a magical formula. So it's not something that you learn and then poof, you already know and understand. And like it's certainly not that, unfortunately. Would be easier if it was, but it's not. And it's also not something. So like I'm a skills trainer, so I don't really I help people develop cultural fluency, but it's not about helping them to find a job abroad or about the logistics of moving abroad or relocation. It's really about getting the skill that you can after leverage when you move abroad or you switch jobs or move into a new team or get a remote job.
I'm sure interviewing for a remote job and applying for a remote job to demonstrate awareness of this concept would definitely be valuable leverage, just to show that you've thought about these things, that maybe you've undertaken training, that you've thought about your own competency.
Absolutely.
To work in a culturally appropriate way will help you. But
Absolutely.
that doesn't mean Cengiz got a pile of jobs any more than I have, I'm afraid. So this is all about helping you, putting you in a good position.
Yeah, I mean, it can even help with the interview, depending on how the other person is. Like if you have some cultural awareness, then you can also notice maybe some differences or, like understand the question better or just to know how to react to certain things. So even that can be very helpful already. But yes, it's certainly not a magical formula. And also another very common preconception I tend to get about cultural fluency is that, okay, so now we understand differences. And does it mean that I have to like everyone? And it really doesn't. It's not. It doesn't work like that. The aim is to understand and to respect the different opinions, but it doesn't mean that if we become culturally fluent, then we have to like everyone. Like that's for sure not. And also, it doesn't give us a free pass for inappropriate behavior. So it's understanding a certain behavior doesn't really justify it. If anything, it's kind of the opposite, that once you're aware of a certain behavior, then it's more like encouraging accountability and to just perceive that behavior differently. So yeah, I do like to clarify these things because cultural fluency is a great skill to have, but it can also be misunderstood sometimes. But I also like to say it's more like a map. So it gives you like some sense of direction, but then you have to figure out where you want to go with it, depending on your own situation. And with that, I also wanted to talk a little more about why actually cultural differences matter. Because as we go through life and we experience life, we are part of many groups. So, like we have our families we grow up in, we go to school, maybe even more schools, we join sports teams, hobbies, then we join workplaces. So we are a part of so many teams throughout our lives that these really bring a lot of different layers into our existence and into how we perceive the world. And because we don't all belong to the same groups, our perceptions as individuals are really different. And so this, even if you are from the same place as someone else, or even if you speak the same language, that doesn't guarantee common understanding. I will get back to this at the practical part because I brought a lot of communication related examples. But it's just important to point out that if we don't realize that every single individual just perceives the world through their unique lenses, that can really lead to a lot of misunderstandings and frustration. And so with that, I also wanted to talk a little bit about culture, because that's kind of what is at the bottom of all this. And I have a favorite definition for culture, which is the way we do things here. And I really like this one because it sounds very simple, but if we start to dissect it a little bit, it's really not. Like if you would ask me like, okay, but then what do you mean by the way? Like that would be a question that would really make me think like, okay, like, because it's something that is so ingrained in our human existence that it sometimes feels hard to explain. So this is one thing why I like this definition. And the other one is because culture is essentially a group habit because it's created through shared experiences with others. It is also different for each group. So this little word here, that also implies that, okay, whatever rules we have here might not apply over there. So that also just shows that if we are a member of different groups, then that can also mean that we experience a lot of different set of rules. And so because it's so ingrained in our upbringing and in our lives, it really shapes how we think, how we behave, what we believe in, what we consider true, and what we essentially consider normal, or what we are used to. And so with that, also, I tend to get this question a lot, how culture connects with personality. Because, as I said, culture is group habits, and it's something that we learn throughout our life. So it's not something that we are born with. So I think this little slide will just help kind of putting those pieces together. According to the first culture expert who worked on this field, Hofstede, our human programming has 3 different levels. The first is human nature, which is really the core aspects of being human, like the instincts, like those things that are universal to all of us, like mostly the biological parts of our existence. But then there's culture, which, as I mentioned, is a group behavior. So this is something that we're exposed to quite a long time in our lives. So we learn those rules. So this is all, for us to adapt to those groups that we are members of. But this is not something we're born with. And then there's personality, which is a mix of the two. So according to him, there are certain parts of our personality that are born with us, so that are ours. And then as we learn through life and we are part of different cultures, we also just put our own unique perception and interpretation on the world. So these are what the behaviors that we perceive from our personality are those behaviors that we really truly consider natural. And I like to point this out because what we consider normal and what we consider natural, they are 2 different things. And it can also happen that when we are in a certain environment where we understand the rules and they feel normal, but at the same time, if our personality is different and we somehow feel that disconnect from it, that can be because it's not necessarily natural to us. And so, I just wanted to point this out. I actually have an example here that I wanted to bring. So when I first moved to Spain and I first went out with a group of Spanish people, that was a very eye-opening experience. So we were like a relatively big group. I think we were around 12. And so for me, a group conversation would go that, we sit down and then we each take turns in talking. There's usually one topic that is discussed, and then we just nicely wait for each other to finish. And then it's all very structured and very linear. And so I went out with the Spanish, and then it was a completely different experience. There were, I think, 4 different conversations going on in parallel, people constantly interrupting each other. I was living in Spain for a couple of months at that time. So even some of the references didn't make sense, but even just the way of how that conversation went, I just couldn't participate because I was waiting for my turn to speak, which never came because that just didn't happen. Like I either interrupt or I don't speak.
Yeah. I totally understand that one. Living in Spain, but working remotely and being much less immersed in the culture, but raising daughters who are in school in Spain. And so they brought that style of conversation back home. And even things like, obviously their first language is English and they're completely fluent in English, but the way we use English language, like the way we litter please and thank you everywhere, that just doesn't translate. And I've had to, when they were younger, they're adults now, I'll give them that. But when they were younger, I used to have to remind them, like if we were visiting grandparents and things, it's not that you're rude, but you just remember to say please and thank you a lot. That's normal and expected. And it's that.
Exactly.
And things like, oh, does anybody want the last piece of this meal or something? No, okay, I'll just take it. No, you don't do that in the UK. You wait your turn. Whereas they were used to the school Commodore, and if they didn't grab that last slice of tortilla, they weren't going to get it. So you just got to go for it.
Exactly. And then, it might not be natural to us to exist this way, but because we live in an environment where this is the normal, we just need to acknowledge that, okay, this is a different way of existing. And I have to say, to this day, like I can now actually have a conversation in a Spanish way, like if I go out with a group of Spaniards, and I can certainly pick up the pace and I can do all those things, but it still doesn't feel like my natural way of being. So yes, I think that's also important for us to acknowledge, because then it also like saves us some frustration knowing that, okay, these things can happen. And so with that, I also, I just wanted to talk a little bit about cultural differences, because when we meet an opposing perspective or we switch environments, which doesn't necessarily have to mean moving countries. So it can also be just, changing schools or visiting relatives in another country, or just even joining a new workplace, a new team. We can face these kind of cultural differences even without knowing that they're actually cultural differences. Because basically what happens is that our brain takes the familiar patterns and the usual lenses that we have to life and try to interpret and navigate the complete new surroundings through those lenses, which more often than not, there's a mismatch, because it's just impossible to understand something that we don't know through our lived experiences. And so this is what we call cultural differences. This is basically what happens when we try to interpret something through something that we think we know, but then we don't really know because it's new. It's an automatic way of how our brain functions. So it's not because we don't necessarily want to know, but it's just our brain automatically puts a meaning to things. So this is why it's important to just stop and reflect and see what we can do with these different perceptions. And this can be the reason why we sometimes struggle to get along with certain individuals, which is, I like this image a lot because it kind of sums it up quite nicely.
Definitely. We're looking from different points of view. We see something completely different.
Exactly. And we can both be right, but if we don't know what's happening here, then we can have a very long argument about how that's a 9 or a 6. And these usually come from value differences, which goes much deeper than we usually imagine. So this is why these differences can feel very frustrating at times. And so with that, we'll move on to the practice part. I don't know if there are any clarification questions or...
We had a really interesting comment about what here means in terms of the definition of how culture is constructed, because this is something that Louise brought up, and I thought it's really fascinating actually, because we see particularly when with remote work, we see pockets of culture forming around different areas and people taking it with them and reconstructing it locally.
Yeah, I think that's that happens quite a lot. I actually wrote my master thesis about like immigrant groups in Brussels that had the same phenomena, that they just moved there, but then they created their own little culture. I would say that's kind of a lack of adaptation in a sense. I'm not sure I would be able to scientifically explain it, but that happens quite a lot because also it's a new environment, especially if you don't speak the language. It also makes sense that you're looking for more comfort or just any kind of anchor so that it helps you be in that new environment. And then
it sounds like you and Louise should talk about this. You've both researched this in different contexts and found
I would be very happy
things.
to do that. I can rabbit hole on these things a lot, so
fantastic. You're both on LinkedIn, so we'll connect you.
Yeah,
this is great.
But yeah, because it's also the adaptation process, of course, when we move to a different place, that also takes time. That also happens differently for everyone because we all have our different pace. And there's also...
And I suppose culture creates comfort, doesn't it? You want to take a bit of it with you to make you feel at home where you go. And if you can find someone else who relates to that, lots of people latch onto them and maybe they stay there forever. Certainly in parts of Spain, they do. Others want to integrate more and extend their own cultural horizons. So it's a choice, I guess, we're lucky to have.
Exactly. That's a very nice summary. All right, so let's move a little bit more into practice. And with that, I actually brought a question. So what comes to mind if I say, or if you hear in a while, like how long that would be for you?
Oh, that's really interesting. I'd love some comments on this one, but I'm trying to think how I would answer that. I suppose it depends a lot on the context, but
obviously, yeah.
I think it might be quite distant and it's certainly indeterminate. I wouldn't expect someone to come back to me and say, you said in a while, but it still hasn't happened. I think it's very open-ended. That's the way of putting something off.
Yeah, so when I brought this question, because I asked this question in my LinkedIn community a while ago, just to see what comes up. And I brought a couple of comments. I received, I think, in total around 15 or 20 answers to this thread, and every single one of them was a completely different interpretation.
Yeah.
So we literally had everything between as soon as I finish now to like next quarter, which is quite
whatever.
Yeah, which is quite imagine those two people having to work together, like one asking for something that's, can you please do this for me? It's like, sure, I will do it in a while. And then one expecting it to happen in an hour and the other one will just do it next month. So this is certainly, I think that was a very interesting experiment, and also just to see like how we interpret different things very differently, and if we don't clarify these things, or we're just not aware of how this can actually mean different things to everyone, then that can cause a lot of mess. And that's because I mentioned that language goes beyond the words. So just because we speak the same language with someone, that certainly doesn't mean that we have the same understanding. And of course, it's important that we understand or we hear what they say. But at the same time, it's also important to acknowledge that, okay, their context and their cultural references might put a different meaning to these words. And these references really define our interactions a lot. So if you think of like a work context, like, for example, how we give feedback, or how we act at meetings or under stress, or how we approach conflict, or whether we say things out loud or not, these are all influenced by our own context and cultural references. And as I said, these differences usually come from value differences. And being aware of these things, especially in a remote working environment where you usually don't see the whole person, so you don't necessarily pick up on the nonverbal clues, or there are like some visuals that might be missing. I think this is really, really important.
Yeah.
And so I also wanted to just briefly touch upon, because I mentioned in a while as an example, and just wanted to mention a couple of factors that could be behind the interpretation of in a while. And for example, like, the perception or like the value of time, that's certainly something that differs a lot across cultures. I'm sure you all have stories with this, especially if you live in Spain and you're from a
Mañana.
yeah, exactly. Or you get an appointment, but that appointment is also quite flexible. So the interpretation of time is really that's something that is very different across cultures. And it's important to understand this because it also saves us some headaches if we know this. But it's also there are other factors. For example, if the person who says in a while whether they are more people oriented or task oriented, because that can also give different outcomes. And they're also connected with each other. So for example, I tend to say like that people oriented cultures such as Spain, they tend to be like the time tends to be more fluid. Whereas in a task-oriented culture such as the US or the UK, like time is much more rigid and respected because it's more seen as a resource. So these things are all connected together. And of course, they are all, so when I say cultures are this and that, I usually mean statistical averages, which is of course a good starting point, but they're also not the ultimate truth. So I always nudge people to just get into the nuances and really take a look into that, because these things can really influence many things. And yes, and the third one, and which I'm going to go into more details, is also the different communication styles that we have. And I did want to elaborate a little more on this because I think, especially in the remote work world, this can be the trickiest of all. And in a very simplistic way, we have two main communication preferences: direct or objective communication, or indirect or subjective. And basically, direct communicators, they prefer explicit phrases, more using facts, focusing at the task at hand. So really, if you're talking to someone who is a direct communicator or have a direct communication preference, what they say is what they mean, and there's nothing more to it. Whereas for indirect communication, it's more implicit. It's more communicating with metaphors. These environments or people, they also tend to rely more on the nonverbal clues and reading the room or reading between the lines, because also like the group harmony and who is present in the room also matters. So it's not just the task. If I want to bring cultural examples, so for instance, for direct communication, like Scandinavian countries or the US, like they are quite, so I usually tend to talk about these communication preferences as like a sliding scale. And then of course, also us as people and cultures are all over in between, and it's all relative. But let's say like the US and Scandinavian countries tend to be more at the direct end of it because they really, what they say is what they mean. Whereas like Asian cultures or Middle Eastern countries, they tend to be more on the indirect side, where it's more about reading between the lines and not really saying things so directly. And I also just brought a couple of examples just for better understanding that, for example, if you ask someone that, okay, would it be possible to get this done? Like in a direct environment, they would just say, no, we cannot do that. Whereas in an indirect environment, they wouldn't say no, but they also wouldn't really say yes. Like they were, oh, I'm not sure, I'll need to check. Like there are different ways. So just to be aware of this. Or even when you're not happy with something in a direct culture, they will probably just tell you straight away that, like, look, what you just presented was not great because of whatever. But then in an indirect culture, they will probably not say anything, but there will be very strong nonverbal clues that, okay, they might be just giving you the looks or eye rolling, or like they wouldn't make direct comments, but you would see other signs of that disapproval, so to say. And another interesting thing is the meaning of yes, because in a direct communication style, like yes means yes and no means no, but in an indirect, yes can very much mean no. But if we don't know that this can happen, then that can also open another whole can of worms.
Yes. No. Yes.
And I wanted to show a little bit how I work in my work with these differences, because I use a tool to help map these out and also to put it into a more visual way. So I use a tool called Global Disc, which is especially developed for cultural intelligence and to help us see and understand why people think and behave differently. So it measures our preferences based on our personality, and then it shows us not just how we prefer to communicate or what behaviors we prefer, but it also gives us a value layer to it, which is quite interesting to understand. And then so it gives us a lot of insights of why and how our behaviors can differ. And then because it works with the scale, it's also very helpful to see where we can bend our mindsets more so that we would get more culturally fluent. And also another thing I like is that it offers comparisons. So like, for example, this image that I brought, so the person, it's a test thing. So the test person is this little navy figure in the middle. And then on the left, the little light blue figure is representing the UK, like the statistical average reference of the UK. And the red one is Spain. So for instance, we can see that, okay, if our little navy figure would want to move to Spain, for example, then there's a little gap in between the two figures. So then it could be like a nice insight to know that, okay, it can mean that, okay, if they will work with a Spanish team, then they can expect more subjective, more indirect communication. Probably there'll be more small talk at the beginning of the meeting, or there'll be like kind of a more personal touch to it, or it can get more emotional when, you try to reason with people. Of course, these are statistical averages, so they're not necessarily bound to happen, but it's good to be prepared that this can happen. Whereas if they, let's say, move to the UK, then they can be prepared that, okay, then like the communication might be a little more fact-based. It can be more just really focusing at getting the task done and not necessarily going so much into the personal part of it. And also, it's more direct. So it means that there won't be hidden messages in between the lines as much.
Yeah, we got a great comment from Louise again. I wonder where Sweden would sit on this line, or Scandinavian culture.
Good question.
Would it be more in the factual, direct end?
I have to admit,
what are the extremes here?
Yeah, I have to admit I haven't worked with Swedish as much. So I don't have that experience.
Have to talk anyway.
Yeah, certainly we do. But I would say, because I met Swedish in my life, and from the interactions, I would put them a little more towards the objective side.
And what country would be at the abstract extreme?
I think subjective, I would put probably either Asian countries there, because in Asia that happens a lot, that people say yes because they don't want to hurt your feelings, but that really means a no.
Yes. So when will this development work be finished? In a while.
Yeah. So based on my experience, or even with the deadlines that are a bit more fluid, I would say that's a little more on the other end of it. But of course, this is also all relative. So this is obviously depends on each thing. But it's just interesting to be aware of all these differences. And I really like the sliding scale, because it also helps us to see that, let's say, if we're moving to a country which is more at the abstract end, but then we're in the middle, then that's quite a gap that we might face. So it's also easier to be prepared and just kind of mentally brace ourselves to bridge that gap. And yes, and just to finish with this part, I also brought this image, which I really like. This is just on a fun note. That this, the typical email phrases that we see that often mean a different thing. And I'd like to show this one, because also it's, as I said, it's all relative and it's not the ultimate truth. So of course, like, we face these differences, and there's also, of course, the value difference and all that. But I always say that this is just really like a map or like a blueprint for us to know how to approach these differences and how to navigate our interactions. But of course, it's also not the ultimate truth. So this is why I also brought this. And then I brought the emojis, which, I would advise.
Another layer of communication.
Yeah. I mean, even in person, like, the gestures certain cultures use are very different. So I would advise that, especially in a work context, like, think twice before you send any emoji, because really, like, it can be so differently interpreted, and it can
I can get that wrong in a family WhatsApp group across generations, never mind cultures.
100%. Yeah, I didn't even add the generational layer to it. But it's like, I put, for example, these two, because like in some cultures, like, you do this to say it's okay, but then you can also do this in other cultures. And then, so there are just so many differences to the gestures that I would say, you know, when in doubt, like don't use emojis.
Be
I would
careful.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah. And with that, I also brought some tips that can help us improve our cultural fluency. And the first one is really, when in doubt, ask questions, which might seem very straightforward and simple, but it usually isn't. There's this quote that goes that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place, which I really like, because it's people usually complain about under communicating, but they don't complain about over communicating. So with this in mind, I do like to encourage asking questions, especially if there's any doubt. It's just better not to fall into this trap and save the frustration, and just clarify, ask back, or what I really like to do when I'm not sure that what has been said is really what was said. I really like to confirm back that, okay, let me just confirm that this is what I understood, and then you can tell me whether that was really the message you were trying to tell me. Because it's I think we very much underestimate the power of asking questions. I do like to encourage everybody to do that. And with that, especially if you start working in a new team or if you work remotely, I would also encourage to set expectations especially around communication, if you work with many people, because it just makes collaboration easier. There are also less headaches, and with that, you can make sure that there are less things getting lost on the way. Especially if you have someone that you struggle more to communicate with, like this can be a very good conversation. And before actually having that conversation, I would also just advise to sit down and reflect on how this actually looks like for you, like how your preferences are, like what way you prefer to receive communication or give communication. Or you can even go about it from a different angle. Just think of what drives you crazy. And that should give you also a good image of, you know, what's at the other end and what could actually work much better. And then once you know this for yourself, it can also help you have these conversations with others in a work context, and then just make the collaboration smoother. And the third one is, really, I encourage you to get to know your preferences better, and really just educate yourself and stay curious, really, because, the culture is not something static. It really, it's dynamic. It changes because we also change, and as we move also to different places, or we get, to a different place in life, or even as we're aging, like there are just changes all the time. So staying curious is really something that can help us in the long term. And if you're just starting out, like there's a book that I would very much recommend as a first read, is The Culture Map from Aaron Meyer, which is a really, really good book. It's very easy to understand, very easy to read, and it's very practical. And it brings a lot of business and like communication examples, which I thought was very helpful when I read it. And it also very much shows, because the examples it brings are from different cultures, it also shows how relative things can be. So I think that's a very valuable first read. And also I tend to recommend, I call it the iceberg exercise, but it's really just a reflection exercise on your own values and behaviors. And you can start either way. Like you can start thinking about your typical behaviors and then work to the value layer from there, or you can start thinking of what your values are, or what you would consider as a good value, or like something that feels good to you, and then work through the behaviors from there. So whichever way works for you. And one question I also like to just throw it in here, like just to think about the behaviors you have when nobody's watching you, because it's a reflection exercise. So you don't need to share it with anyone, but just to be honest with yourself, because those can also show you a lot about your own preferences.
Whoa, there's so much to think about here. My mind is racing on the communications track and directness over indirectness, because when I'm working with distributed teams or teams that are hoping to go remote, there's a great emphasis on asynchronous communication. And a lot of what you were talking about, ask clarifying questions, make sure you've been understood and things like that. That's really difficult to do when you're working indirectly. And when you're working with somebody who might not read your answer until you're asleep in the middle of the night for you, and that they're working in their own time. So I think probably there's a piece of work to be done here, kind of connecting the cultural fluency with asynchronous conversation and really trying to, I mean, the good practice is the same in both cases, that yes, you need really clear, unambiguous messages, and trying to maybe shift consciously towards the direct communication end of the spectrum. If you're not going to be around for those clarifying questions, or you need to brief somebody to do something so they completely understand what to do, or breaking it down into a checklist and so on. But I wonder, because I'm very, very systematic like that. And when I'm working with colleagues and even when I'm working with clients, I tend to be very much about lists and checklists. Because I want that to be understood. I don't want them to have to call me and clarify everything. I feel I've done my job correctly if they don't need to ask any follow-up questions. But I wonder if that is the wrong approach with people in a more indirect culture, or how do you get around that when you don't have that context and the body language and everything else?
I wouldn't think it's the wrong approach. I mean, I just kind of spoke about communication, but that's just one aspect of the whole thing. I also do a lot of work with teams. And what I really like doing, even if I do, like, let's say a longer workshop and I work with the same training group participants for a couple of days, I really like to do this, like, I call this team contracting at the beginning, where we just set up our own rules of coexisting collaboration for that amount of time. And then, of course, we speak about communication and we speak about all these things, but then that also involves a lot of other things of the team dynamic part that we just define for ourselves, that, okay, how do we want to function as a team in this space together? And I think that's a great space to actually have these conversations that, okay, you have the preference for the list and you don't really want people to call you, and, these kind of things. And then that's, I think that's a very clear message to the others that, okay, then, they can work this and this and this way to make sure that this norm in the team functions. And then, of course, if there are any kind of emergencies and all that, that's also a different norm that you can add, like, okay, if this happens, then, do this and this and this. So I do like to recommend this a lot, because it's also something that, especially if it's a new team, you set these rules up at the beginning, then you have a strong reference point to go back to if there are conflicts or if there's something that is unclear. And this is something that you can revisit every once in a while, or, at some point, like, okay, let's see if this is still true. Let's see if we still want to continue work this way, if this is still valid for us.
Yes. Have there been any problems using this protocol? Is there anything that's caused a conflict or a miscommunication? Then we can tweak the protocol. This is just like with so many of the things we talk about with remote work that you may never have had to give any thought to before, like you're meeting new people or getting a walk to the station every morning, who fixes your IT when it doesn't work. All these things become your responsibility when you're working remotely, particularly if you're working for yourself. Being able to communicate and understand across cultures as well as language and geographical barriers just it's a whole new layer in, and it's something else to educate yourself in, something else to be aware of all the time. And I can second the Culture Map book. I think that's fantastic. This is, for me, it's quite a short book. I think I've only got it as an ebook. It's
not a very long one.
It's one of those that I keep thinking I should actually buy and have it as a tree book, as well. It's that good.
It's one of the books which is on my bookshelf, and I'm not planning to get rid of it anytime soon.
Yeah, I do buy books. The evidence is there, but so for something to actually make it to paper and carry around with me whenever I move, it has to be pretty good. So I think that's in that category. We do have time for some questions. There was a question actually from Federica about the spectrum of the different countries a few slides back. I don't know if we can flip back to that slide and see what was the reference point there, because there was so much going on there.
Right?
Who's the blue?
So the light blue was the UK. I just brought that because I know that you're from the UK, you live in Spain, so I thought that was a nice example to bring.
Yeah, and what was the one in the middle again?
So the navy blue, that's the person who took the assessment, or like it is a test.
Right.
From a test.
Okay.
So that's the result of
somebody's results. So maybe that could be a Brit who's been in Spain a while and is getting acclimated. It might be my kids growing up in both. And I think, as Louise pointed out, when we do move around, we get influenced by all these different cultures, and it does actually make us feel like I'm more this now or I'm more that now. And It's super interesting the way that, and then you probably don't even notice how much you've changed until you go back to the place you grew up. And you
Absolutely.
think, well, they've changed while I've been away, but actually that's probably not what's happened.
Absolutely. I always tend to point out that if you stay in a culture for a long time, whether you want it or not, it rubs on you, and you don't realize. But then, when you're out of it, or when you're back to your original country, like, you just notice that, okay, like, this is there's something there that is different. And I even, like, from my own experience, because I will go back to Hungary quite a lot, I still have family and friends there. And my friends always joke about how my way of speaking and my gestures became way more Spanish than before. Like, each time we speak, like, I use certain terms or like certain hand gestures that they were just like, okay, like, we don't really do that here. Like, you seem more Spanish. I also, it's at least my environment, they reflect this back. And it's also true that I go back to Hungary and I feel more Spanish, but then I'm here in Spain and I don't feel Spanish. So this is certainly a very interesting phenomenon that I think happens for all of us who move.
We're all third culture kids in that sense. We've all absorbed different bits of each other's cultures, and that's fantastic, that melting pot, something that we can all love and relate to. We just do need to be aware of it, and that it is socially constructed rather than something that is just universal that we all do. I was thinking while you were talking about my very first experience with cultural fluency was actually a long time ago when I was 18. I was traveling and working in a school in Africa. And it was a first generation of young Zimbabweans to be educated. They all had learned English, quite good English often, even though it had been taught by somebody who was not native English in most cases. So along with the very strong Afrikaans accent, the sort of the courtesies and the gestures, the please and thank yous. I remember a kid coming to me for a book and saying, "Can I have that?" And I'd hand it to them and they just turn away. And I go, "Hey, come on, if I'm going to teach you English, you need to learn that you say thank you here. This is, if you want to interact with English people, what you did felt very rude to me." But of course, he would never have dreamed of accepting that book using only one hand instead of two, because that would have been really disrespectful. He showed me how grateful he was by accepting it with both hands.
Yeah, that's a really good example at how, these small nuances and just communicating in the same language doesn't give us common understanding at all.
It was really, and we talked about it, and he explained that, I didn't thank you because I just accepted it respectfully and graciously. And I said, yeah, okay, that doesn't cut it with a native English person. You need the word as well. And, we were able to learn something about each other's culture instead of both of us thinking, oh, how rude. And then moving on.
Yeah, that's amazing that you were able to have that conversation, because I think it's a good example for this, direct, non-direct communication that, like, you as with your more direct preference, you expected the explicit thank you, whereas the other person with their indirect preference, they said thank you in a very different way.
Yes, and they'd learned the language, but not from a native. So I think by his incredibly fluent language and accent, I wasn't expecting there to be that big cultural gap. So it really illustrated that for me and made me start thinking about these things. Got a great question here from Frederica about resolving these clashes. I suppose you have to identify them in the first place, but how do we get around this?
So for teams, the good thing is that this tool, this global disk that I use with the scale, it works for teams. So I can, if there's a team, like, everybody takes the assessment and I can put everyone on that scale. So they actually see where everybody stands, and it's anonymous. So it's not like, it comes with a name, and then, like, the idea is not to point fingers. It's just it's really just to see where the whole team stands, because the tool also measures the cognitive diversity of the team. So it actually shows where the blind spots of the teams are. And then that, of course, that gives us a diagnosis, right? Or like a current state kind of picture. And then from there, we can do a workshop and do different dynamics just to really uncover that, okay, like, what can that mean? Or like, just to see what's behind this. So that's a very good starting point to work for a team. And then, of course, the issues that come up, that is specific for the situation of every team, but we can certainly diagnose those with these tools.
Fantastic. Yeah, so that's the kind of work that you do with teams professionally then?
Yes. So for individuals, I do offer this more in a, like, in an individual coaching, training sort of setting. That, if they want to just be better and develop, that's a different approach. But then for teams, I can actually offer workshops that are more based on where the team is at, what are they struggling with, and really identify those issues. And then from there, we build something that they can work with.
So maybe if a manager's got a communication problem or an understanding problem that doesn't seem to be resolving through the normal management approaches and looking at the tools and communications protocols, maybe there's something going on at this intercultural layer that people haven't even noticed or become aware of because it's never affected their work before. If they, why does this person keep nodding but they're not delivering? Maybe it's because in their culture they cannot give me a direct no. That's not possible. And it looks like underperformance, but actually they can't express what you need to know, which is that your expectations aren't realistic. It must be such interesting work. So tell us about the work you do with individuals as well, because I think that might be of interest to people here.
Yeah, so that I do offer different individual packages, some that are geared towards those who plan to move abroad. And so we can map using these tools. And of course, I'm asking questions and having an actual conversation, like really map out their own individual preferences and where they sit in these whole things. And then if they move countries, then we can also talk about like their country of destination or their country of origin and put that into that context. But then I also work with those who actually work globally and just want to understand these preferences better and how to communicate better with stakeholders from different countries. So I can help both of these groups. And I also occasionally do courses. In autumn, I'll probably do one, which is also more about like cultural fluency in general. And we go through all these things and the value differences in a small group setting. So yes, I do this.
Please share details of that with us, and we'll put it out to our members, because I think this is going to have piqued the curiosity of a lot of people. And if they're not at a point where they're ready to access individual consultancy on it, then a course would be a good route into expanding that awareness further. And I think a lot of this is simply about identifying the things you don't know.
Exactly. I always say it's a lot about self-awareness. Like I've been living abroad and working abroad for a very long time now. I also work with different countries and continents all over the place. And even so, I still discover new things about myself, about my preferences. Also, as I change as a person, there are always new things coming up. So I think it's really just the key is to keep this awareness and follow the curiosity.
Fantastic. Now, do we have any more questions for Chenge? This replay is going to be available on our website, and it's also, we've streamed across a number of our social media sites. Not as many as we used to, because nowadays Meta makes that very difficult, but we have got the message out as widely as we can. And I want to circle back to the comment threads, because they don't always come up as well here in our live feed as we would hope. But I think the questions and comments that we've had have been really insightful and interesting, and they've helped us move this conversation on. So thank you for saying thank you, Lee, Catherine, Federica, Louise. It's been really great to have your involvement and input, because this is about communication at the end of the day and how we connect with each other. Chenge, is there anything else you'd like to add, or anywhere that you can, any last minute recommendations where to connect with you? Is LinkedIn the best place?
Yes, LinkedIn is the best place. That's where I'm the most active. And I also have a newsletter. I sent two of them, one shorter and one longer, one each month, which is partially also reflecting on my experience, also giving tips and all that. So it's also worth signing up for that.
Amazing. Well, we're really grateful that you came and shared this insight with us today. You've given me lots to think about. I can tell that you've really given people in our audience lots to think about as well. Remote work has so many nuances and aspects to it. It's a lot to get right a lot of the time, but the more we know and understand about other people's contexts, the better we can do. So Chenge, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Maya, for the opportunity. I'm very glad that it was helpful.